The hollow lies empty now, but the wind that passes through it still carries something sharp, the echo of children's voices that history tried to silence. What were they asking to be remembered? It was found in a cedar trunk, wrapped not in tissue or pressed between pages, but hidden beneath a layer of moth-eaten quilts. A single photograph, its edges curled, the gloss dulled by years of dust. At first glance, it looked like any turn-of-the-century family portrait. A cluster of faces arranged stiffly before a clapboard farmhouse, eyes fixed on the camera, mouths unsmiling in the long exposure. But when the light struck the paper just right, the details emerged, and it became clear why this particular photograph had never been given a frame, why it had not been pasted into the Blevins family album with the others. The parents stand at the center, their posture rigid, as though pressed into dignity by the presence of the lens. The father's hands rest heavily on the shoulders of his wife, whose expression is stern, almost vacant. Around them, the children are arranged by height, the older ones standing, the younger seated on stools or propped against their mother's skirts. It is here, at the edge of the group, that the image falters into unease. One child's figure seems blurred, though the others are sharp. The head is too large for the body, the face caught in half-profile, as if turned away in the moment the shutter fell. The mouth gapes slightly open, revealing teeth that look oddly spaced, and the eyes, what can be seen of them, seem unfocused, looking not at the camera but somewhere just past it. Local memory does not recall this photograph ever being shown. In other portraits of the Blevins clan, the children appear in perfect order, each face clear, each figure accounted for. But this single print, unearthed in an attic long abandoned, tells a different story, that not all the Blevins' children were meant to be seen. The paper itself shows signs of tampering. The lower right corner is torn, as if someone once tried to remove a figure. A faint crease runs across the image, directly over the blurred child, as though the photograph had been folded to hide that portion from view. Historians who examined it noted that the chemical stain along the edges was not the result of time alone. It looked as if the photograph had been deliberately mishandled, rubbed with damp cloth or thumb until the details of that child's face could no longer be easily recognized. And yet, even through the damage, the outline remains. A head too large, a gaze averted, a presence that resists erasure. The family posed as though to present itself to the world, but this child is the disruption, the reason the image was hidden. It raises the question whispered in town for generations but never written in any record. How many children were born in that hollow, and how many were ever allowed to be seen? The hollow was a place the sun seemed reluctant to touch. Tucked deep within the folds of the Blue Ridge, it was less a valley than a pocket of land hidden by thick stands of hemlock and laurel, where the air stayed damp and the soil seemed to breathe with a quiet unease. The narrow path that wound upward was little more than a goat trail, overgrown with brambles, slick with moss when it rained, and treacherous even in daylight. Few from the nearby town had reason to make the climb, and those who did often returned with a silence heavier than the baskets they carried. At the center of this hollow stood the Blevins farmhouse, a structure that had once been whitewashed but was now gray and peeling, its boards warped from years of mountain weather. The shutters remained closed in every season, as if the house itself had chosen to look away from the world below. A stone chimney leaned precariously at one side, its smoke thin and constant, suggesting life inside but never inviting. The porch sagged under its own weight, and yet, according to the few who had stood before it, the house gave the impression not of abandonment but of watchfulness, as though the family within knew exactly who approached, and why. Neighbors in town whispered about the hollow in low voices, careful not to speak too directly. It was said that the Blevinses had lived there since before the Civil War, carving a life from the hills, refusing to sell land even when mines pressed into nearby ridges. Their isolation was not merely habit but determination, a fierce boundary marked by silence. Children in school heard stories of how lantern lights moved at night between the trees, though no one was seen carrying them. Hunters claimed the sound of voices would drift down through the timber laughter, sometimes crying, but the language was thick, mumbled, almost animal. The rare visitor who reached the farmhouse spoke of being received without warmth or hostility, only with a stillness that pressed upon the air. Meals were served but eaten in silence. Questions were met with stares rather than answers. The younger children, if glimpsed at all, were hurried past doorways or kept behind the hems of skirts, their faces obscured by hair or shadow. No one from the hollow ever attended church, though their names still appeared in the parish ledgers, as if absence had become a tradition of its own. What unsettled most was not what was seen, but what was never shown. Windows remained shuttered even on the hottest days of July. Curtains did not stir, even when mountain winds howled through the trees. Travelers who camped too close to the ridge spoke of faint knocking sounds, irregular and muffled, as if coming from beneath the earth rather than from the farmhouse itself. The hollow, they said, had a way of swallowing sound, bending it until you could no longer tell if it came from the woods, the house, or something in between. The Blevins Hollow became a name spoken like a warning, never in sermons, rarely in print, but passed in whispers by mothers to children, neighbors to strangers. It was not a place one wandered into, but a place one avoided, unless called there by the family themselves. For those who lived below, the hollow was less geography than boundary, a reminder that some lives were meant to remain apart, and that behind shuttered windows might dwell truths the valley was not prepared to confront. The story of the Blevins clan was written not in newspapers or church announcements but in the brittle pages of courthouse ledgers and marriage records stacked in dust. Each name led back to another Blevins, each certificate echoing the same handful of surnames that wound around one another like vines choking their own branches. The explanation was always the same when questioned by officials or neighboring families: outsiders could not be trusted. The mountains had raised them in solitude, they said, and solitude was how they would remain. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Families often married close in those remote ridges where travel was hard and communities small. But with each generation, the pattern tightened. Cousins wedding cousins, uncles marrying nieces, the same blood circling back into itself. Over time, the line grew insular, the branches of the family tree bending inward until no limb reached beyond the hollow. The features of the Blevins clan began to echo one another with uncanny precision. Faces that should have been distinct looked like mirrors with slight distortions, a nose too flat, a jaw too prominent, eyes that seemed set just a little too far apart. Photographs from the county archives show children who resemble both siblings and parents so closely that strangers had to ask who was who. Travelers who passed through the area whispered of a sameness that clung to the family, as though their likeness had become a mask repeated too many times. Some children were fair-haired while others were dark, but beneath those differences lay a rhythm of familiarity, the same slope of cheek, the same tilt of chin, repeated generation after generation. By the turn of the 20th century, it was said you could spot a Blevins from a distance even if you had never met one, the line of their shoulders and the cast of their gaze marking them as unmistakable. Yet within the hollow, the family defended its choices as strength. They claimed that keeping to their own blood preserved loyalty, preserved survival, preserved a lineage uncorrupted by the greed and intrusion of the outside world. But not all evidence supported that claim. Records show an unusual number of infants listed as stillborn or lost in infancy, with no graves to match. Midwives who traveled up the mountain seldom returned for a second visit. And in rare moments of candor, neighbors recalled hearing that the children born there did not always look as they should. The insularity bred not only physical likeness but secrecy. The Blevinses stopped attending public gatherings, ceased visiting the county fair, and sent no children to the schoolhouse below. To outsiders, their lives seemed to have folded inward just as their bloodlines had, a world contained within the weathered walls of their farmhouse and the ridges that kept the hollow cloaked. Whatever might have been hidden there, whatever faces grew stranger with each generation, the silence of the mountains ensured that few beyond the valley would ever know. In the winter of 1912, when the snow pressed heavy on the ridges and the roads became little more than frozen ruts, the Blevins sent for the town physician. The summons came not by letter, but by a boy on horseback, silent save for a brief message. The doctor was needed at once. No details were given, no plea of sickness or injury, only the insistence that he come under cover of night. Against his better judgment, and with the weight of duty on his shoulders, he packed his satchel, lit his lantern, and began the climb toward the hollow. The path was treacherous even in daylight, but that night the moon was veiled and the wind clawed through the trees. The doctor's horse balked near the ridge, refusing to move farther, so he dismounted and made the final stretch on foot. When he reached the farmhouse, its shutters closed tight against the cold, he was met without a word. A man from the family opened the door just wide enough to usher him inside. The air reeked of smoke, damp wool, and something else, something metallic, faintly sour, like rusted iron. What he saw within, the doctor never fully described. He would only say, years later, that the room was dimly lit, the fire stifled as though to prevent too much being revealed. He was guided down a narrow hallway, past doors that seemed bolted from the outside. Behind them, he thought he heard movement, the shuffle of feet, a muffled cry, perhaps a child's voice, though strained and unnatural in tone. In the back chamber, the patient waited. Some say it was a mother in labor, others that it was a child already born. Whatever the truth, the physician worked quickly, his hands steady though his breath caught in his throat. He did not stay longer than necessary. When he descended the mountain hours later, lantern dimming in the pre-dawn cold, his face was ashen, his eyes hollow. He returned to his practice but made no entry in his medical ledger. Neighbors noticed his hands trembling when he lifted a cup, his eyes darting toward the window as if fearing what might come down from the ridge. Questions pressed upon him in the weeks that followed, but he deflected them all. To those who persisted, he muttered only one phrase, his voice low and broken. Some children should not have been born. He never returned to the hollow. Others would go in years to come, each emerging with the same silence clamped over their tongues. But it was the physician's refusal, the man bound by oath to record, to speak truth that cast the longest shadow. Whatever he saw within those shuttered walls, he chose to bury it in silence, leaving only a fragment of warning that deepened the mystery of the Blevins Hollow rather than dispelling it. The old church book was kept in a cabinet with rusted hinges, its pages warped by damp and years of careless handling. Most entries were routine, the kind of records every parish carried. Marriages marked with small flourishes, baptisms noted in neat columns, deaths recorded with dates and scripture references. Yet when the eye lingered on the pages devoted to the Blevins family, a pattern began to emerge, one too peculiar to be coincidence. Their name appeared again and again in the baptismal register, far more frequently than most families in the valley. Infants carried into the church swaddled in wool, water sprinkled on their foreheads, names whispered into the official record. But for every baptism entered, the corresponding page of burials remained strangely empty. At first, one might assume the children had survived, their names simply carried forward into later years, but as the book continued, those names vanished. No confirmations, no marriages, no adult deaths decades later. It was as if the baptized children dissolved into air after their christening, present only long enough to be acknowledged by the church, before slipping into silence. When parishioners looked closer, they counted more than a dozen such names spanning 3 decades, each with dates of baptism, none with graves recorded. The churchyard itself held no evidence. Weathered stones leaned beneath the weight of years, carved with the names of local families, but the Blevins plot showed only a scattering of markers. A handful of elders, a few women who had died in childbirth, but no infants. The ground bore no mounds, no tiny headstones etched with lambs or angels, as was customary for children lost too soon. The absence was glaring, a void that spoke louder than any inscription. Whispers passed quietly between pews on Sunday mornings. Some suggested the infants were buried in secret up in the hollow, placed in shallow graves near the farmhouse where no outsider might intrude. Others claimed there were no burials at all, that the children did not die naturally but were hidden away, kept from sight for reasons no one dared put to words. The minister himself was asked about the discrepancy once, but he dismissed it with a curt wave, saying records were often incomplete. Still, those who had handled the book knew the handwriting well, the care with which other entries had been made. The omissions were not accidents, they were choices. Each missing grave sharpened the suspicion already circling the Blevins' name. Where had the children gone? Why baptize them publicly, only to erase their existence in every other way? In the quiet of the church, with its cracked plaster walls and faded hymns, the unanswered question lingered like incense that never fully cleared. The ledger told a story, but not the whole of it. The truth lay elsewhere, in the hollow, where records ended and silence began. He was a circuit preacher, the kind who carried little more than a weathered satchel, a hymnal, and the conviction that every soul in the mountains deserved saving. His journal, later found among his belongings, records his arrival to the Blevins Hollow on a late autumn afternoon, when the leaves lay wet and bright along the ridges, and the air smelled of wood smoke. The invitation, if it could be called that, had been vague, a message carried down by a boy who said his family wished for a sermon. Few had ever known the Blevins to seek out the church, but the preacher, eager to extend the Lord's reach into the most secluded corners, accepted without hesitation. The farmhouse looked gray against the darkening trees, its shutters latched tight, even in daylight. He wrote that when he entered, the room smelled of damp earth and ash, the floorboards worn smooth by generations of heavy steps. The family gathered in silence, their faces shadowed by the dim glow of a single oil lamp. He began with a hymn, his voice lifting in the hollow space, but no one joined him. Instead, as he opened his Bible and spoke of faith and endurance, he heard it, the faint sound of singing, not from those gathered before him, but from somewhere deeper in the house. At first he thought it was imagination, an echo of his own hymn still clinging to the rafters, but the voices grew clearer. They were high-pitched, the tones sharp and unsettling, carrying a rhythm that twisted the familiar cadence of church songs into something off-key, something almost mocking. He described them as children's voices, though there was a strain in them, a discord that set the hair on his neck upright. They sang behind closed doors, unseen, their words blurred as though the verses were remembered wrong or spoken in a tongue half familiar and half broken. The preacher faltered mid-sermon, his hand tightening around the pulpit he had improvised from a chair. He looked to the family for explanation, but none moved. Their faces were impassive, their eyes fixed not on him, but on the closed hallway door. The voices behind it rose and fell in a strange harmony, laughter bleeding into song, song collapsing into hums that rattled like bees in a hive. Sweat broke on his brow, though the room was cold. He wrote that he felt watched, not by the family in front of him but by whatever lay behind those walls. His words stumbled, his sermon trailed into silence. The voices carried on, unbroken, as if they had no need for his scripture. And then, without quite realizing how, he closed his Bible, set it on the chair, and stepped back. His journal ends the entry abruptly. I left it behind, for I could not carry the word out with me. They would not hear, they sing their own. When he emerged into the evening air, the chill struck him like a reprieve. He descended the path at a near run, lantern swinging wildly, never once daring to look back. He never returned to the hollow. The Bible he abandoned was never recovered. For years afterward he would not speak of that night aloud, but in his journal the warning was plain. Not every song in those mountains was meant for worship, and not every voice behind closed doors belonged to something that wished to be saved. The maid who later spoke of the forbidden room was young, barely 16, and had taken the position out of desperation rather than choice. Work was scarce in the valley, and though most families warned their daughters against taking employ with the Blevinses, hunger often spoke louder than caution. She arrived at the farmhouse one damp spring morning and was shown directly to the kitchen, her instructions brief and cold: prepare meals, clean dishes, and keep to the lower floor. The rest of the house, she was told, was not her concern. For a time she obeyed. The family kept to themselves, drifting in and out of rooms without much speech, their faces pale in the lamplight. But what unsettled her most was not their silence but the sound that came from above. Each night, after the lamps were dimmed, she heard movement on the second floor. At first she thought it the usual stirrings of a large household, footsteps pacing, furniture shifted. Yet the longer she listened, the stranger the sounds became. It was not the steady tread of walking, but something uneven, dragging, as though a body was being pulled across the floorboards. Her curiosity grew until one afternoon, while scrubbing the kitchen floor, she found herself staring up at the staircase. Dust motes drifted in the air, and at the top landing a single door stood closed, darker than the others. Unlike the rest, its handle bore scratches as if clawed at from within. She later swore she felt a chill emanate from that direction, a cold that had nothing to do with draft or weather. The family never mentioned the room. When she asked once if she might bring linens upstairs, the matriarch's hand struck the table sharply, rattling the dishes, and the girl was told in a flat voice never to climb beyond the first landing. That night, she heard the sounds again, this time accompanied by a noise that froze her blood. It was a voice, or something like one, deep and guttural, not rising into words but slipping into tones too raw to be language. It groaned, then muttered, then broke into a sound like choking laughter before falling silent. She lay awake until dawn, her blanket pulled tight, ears straining for more. When morning came, she packed her belongings without asking leave, fled down the path, and did not stop until the hollow was far behind. Only years later, when questioned by neighbors, did she finally speak of the forbidden room. Her voice shook as she recalled it. The dragging steps, the inhuman murmurs, and the terrible certainty that something waited on the other side of that door, something the Blevins family lived with but refused to let the world see. The story of the torn photograph was first told by an old framer whose shop sat on the edge of the nearest town. He had worked for decades, preserving family memories in gilt frames and polished glass, careful with every print that passed through his hands. One afternoon, a member of the Blevins family arrived with a portrait wrapped in brown paper. The man offered little conversation, only a curt instruction: have it framed and ready by week's end. When the package was unwrapped, the framer paused. The image was stark, a family lined in their stiffest clothes, the farmhouse rising in the background. What caught his eye was the number of children. There were 5, their faces unevenly spaced, their bodies arranged like mismatched pieces of a puzzle. 2 of them stood close to the parents, while 3 lingered at the far edge, their expressions blurred but distinct enough to unsettle. The framer admitted he felt a chill while studying the photograph. The smallest child's eyes seemed fixed on him rather than the camera, the gaze faintly off-center, sharp where the rest of the print was soft. Yet he put the unease aside and did his work. Days later, when the Blevins returned, something had changed. The photograph he handed back bore only 3 children, the image cropped so tightly it seemed unnatural. The father and mother still stood at the center, but the outer edge of the photo, the portion that had once held 2 more children, was gone, cleanly cut away. When neighbors later asked what had happened, the framer swore it was not his doing. He claimed the photograph he had received was whole, intact, and showed all 5 children. Yet when the Blevins came to collect it, they refused the original and demanded the altered version instead. He said the patriarch himself had torn the photo in 2, right there on the counter, his hands unflinching as he folded and ripped the glossy paper. The missing half, the framer remembered, was carried out under the man's arm, never to be seen again. What disturbed him most was not the destruction but the look on the faces of the children who remained. In the cropped photograph, their positions appeared wrong, as though they leaned toward siblings who were no longer there. Their gazes reached into blank space, their shoulders angled toward absence. For years the framer kept the memory close, troubled by what he had witnessed but unwilling to speak it aloud. Only in old age did he finally tell it, that once he had seen 5 Blevins children in a portrait, and that the family had torn away the proof before it could ever be displayed. The photograph that hung in their parlor showed only what they permitted the world to see. The rest had been erased, not by accident, but by design. The abandoned coal mine lay half a mile beyond the hollow, its entrance collapsed in places, its timbers blackened with rot. By the 1890s, it had been deserted for years, but locals still spoke of hearing echoes when they passed near it, sharp sounds, out of place in the silence of the mountains. Some swore the Blevins children were hidden there, spirited into the shafts whenever outsiders approached the farmhouse. The mine, with its labyrinth of tunnels carved into the earth, offered the perfect refuge, dark and endless, a place where cries and footsteps would be swallowed whole. Farmers riding along the ridge claimed they sometimes saw lantern light flicker at the mouth of the cave, though no one lived near enough to keep a lamp burning there. Others dismissed the mine entirely, convinced the children had never left the house at all. To them, the shuttered windows of the farmhouse were explanation enough. The sounds heard on summer nights, the scraping of chairs, the muffled wail that might have been an infant, were proof that whatever lived in that family remained within those walls. They pointed out that no Blevins child was ever enrolled in the schoolhouse, no boy or girl ever appeared at a church picnic, no voice was ever heard in the valley playgrounds. To keep them in the mine would have required too many hands, too much risk. Easier, they reasoned, to bolt doors from the outside and let silence serve as guard. Both stories persisted, trading places over the years depending on who was asked. The mine became a symbol for those who believed the family had something to hide, a grave dug too wide to fill. The farmhouse, meanwhile, stood as a reminder that walls could be as confining as rock. Neither version spoke of joy or freedom, only concealment. And in both versions, the children were described the same way, seen briefly, only in fragments. A face glimpsed through lace curtains, pale and oddly shaped. A sound that might have been laughter, though pitched too high to seem natural. What kept the rumors alive was the absence of proof. No one had the courage to search the tunnels, to pry open the doors at the top of the farmhouse stairs. Instead, the stories grew in whispers, repeated at kitchen tables and on church porches, until they hardened into a kind of folklore. The Blevins children became phantoms of the hollow, their existence sustained not by presence but by rumor, never permitted to step into daylight where strangers might judge what the family had kept hidden. Whether underground in the mine or sealed away in rooms above, their lives were measured not in years but in silence. The teacher came from the valley below, a young woman with more conviction than caution. She had heard the rumors like everyone else that the Blevins children did not attend school, that their names were spoken only in church ledgers but never seen on the playground. Where others accepted this as the way of the hollow, she saw a duty. Children, she reasoned, had a right to letters and numbers, to the hymns and histories that bound the community together. Against the warnings of her neighbors, she volunteered to climb the narrow path and offer her service as their tutor. The Blevins family received her without warmth, but they did not refuse. A chair was placed in a corner of the parlor, and she was told she might teach there. The air in the room was close, the curtains drawn so tight that only thin lines of sunlight fell across the floor. One by one the children entered, their steps hesitant, their eyes darting not toward her but to the adults standing at the edges of the room. There were 4 of them that day, though she could not be certain if that was the whole. Their faces were pale, their features familiar in a way that made her uneasy, as though she had seen the same brow, the same chin, repeated in too many combinations. She began with simple lessons, letters scratched onto a slate, numbers counted aloud. But almost at once she felt the air shift. The children's voices were thin but strangely resonant, carrying an echo that did not belong to their age. When she asked one to recite the Lord's Prayer, he did so fluently, but the cadence was off, the words spoken as though he had memorized them backward. Another child sat silent for long stretches, eyes fixed on her face without blinking once, not even when dust motes drifted into the shafts of light. The teacher pressed on, though her throat tightened with unease. She tried a hymn, her voice trembling as she sang the first verse. The children joined in, but their voices clashed, sliding over the melody until it became unrecognizable. What should have been a chorus of innocence turned discordant, heavy with something she could not name. One child laughed midway through, not with joy but with a dry, rasping sound that seemed far too old for his frame. When the lesson ended, the family thanked her with curt nods, but did not invite her to return. She descended the path with her satchel clutched tightly, her face pale, and her hands shaking. To those who asked later, she would only say that the children had voices far older than their years, and that no learning she could offer would ever undo what already lived inside them. She never climbed the hollow again, and the Blevins children remained where they always had educated, perhaps, but not in any way the valley understood. It was a spectacle so rare that whenever the Blevins family came down from the hollow, word spread quickly across the valley. They never arrived without warning. Their appearances seemed rehearsed, deliberate, as though designed to remind the townsfolk that they still belonged to the community, even if only in name. One such occasion was remembered for years afterward, a summer picnic held in the field beside the church. The day had been bright, the air humming with the sound of cicadas, when the family appeared at the edge of the gathering, moving in a cluster like shadows cast by the Sunday. They carried with them neatly folded blankets and heavy baskets, but they did not mingle. Instead, they chose a patch of ground apart from the others, close enough to be seen, yet far enough to discourage approach. The adults spread the blankets with stiff precision, setting out jars of preserves and loaves of bread, each item carefully arranged as though the act itself were for display. The women opened parasols against the sun, tilting them just so, their faces hidden beneath wide brims. The children followed in silence. There were 3 that day, though some swore afterward there had been 4, one slipping away unnoticed into the shadow of the trees. They were dressed in pale fabrics, their skin chalky beneath the shade of their bonnets. Not one raised a head, not one lifted a voice. They sat side by side on the blanket, hands folded in their laps, their stillness unsettling in contrast to the laughter and shouting of the other children running barefoot through the grass. Mothers in the crowd nudged one another, whispering about how the Blevins young never played, never spoke, never seemed to breathe the way children should. When a group of town boys kicked a ball too close, it rolled to the edge of the Blevins' blanket. One of the children might have reached for it, but none did. Instead, the smallest turned slightly, the bonnet tilting just enough for a glimpse of what lay beneath. A pale cheek, an eye too large for the face, a mouth that twitched as though struggling to form a smile but never quite succeeding. The boy who had come for the ball froze, then snatched it up quickly without a word. The parents of the other children ushered them back toward the games, their laughter suddenly dimmed. The picnic continued, songs sung and prayers offered, but the Blevins did not join. They ate little, drank less, and when the gathering drew to a close, they packed their things in silence. Blankets folded, parasols lowered, baskets lifted once more. As they left, the children walked in perfect step, their heads bowed, their faces still hidden. Those who watched said it was as if they had never come at all, except for the memory of their silence, a silence that lingered long after the last hymn was sung and the field emptied of voices. The carnival came through the valley in the summer of 1924, a brief blaze of color and noise in a place more accustomed to silence. Wagons rattled down the main road, banners unfurled, and for 3 days the fields near the river filled with the sounds of barkers, fiddlers, and the laughter of children tasting sugar for the first time in months. Among the workers was a man named Garrison, a drifter who had followed carnivals for most of his life, sleeping beneath canvas and eating from tin plates. He had seen enough oddities in his years: two-headed calves, painted frauds, even a traveling strongman who whispered prayers before each lift, to think little of the strange. But it was during his stay in the valley that he encountered something he would never forget. On the second night, after the last lanterns had dimmed and the crowds had dispersed, Garrison wandered away from camp in search of quiet. He followed the curve of the ridge, drawn by the faint glow of another lantern burning high above the town. He would later swear he did not know the place he had come to until he stood at the edge of the hollow and saw the Blevins farmhouse, its windows shuttered, but its outline sharp against the darkened trees. From one upper window, a single light flickered. He paused, thinking it only a candle left too near the glass. Then the curtain shifted. Behind the shutter, pressed against the faint glow, was a face. At first, it seemed only a child, thin and pale, the forehead broad, the eyes wide and fixed upon him. But as Garrison's gaze lingered, he noticed what unsettled him most: the jaw, too heavy, too long, hanging below the proportions of the rest of the head. It belonged to a man, not a child, and yet the body it was attached to was small, narrow, shouldered, no more than 10 years old. The figure did not move away when it realized it was being watched. Instead, it stayed at the glass, the mouth twitching as though trying to form words, though none reached him. For a moment, Garrison thought it might have been smiling, but the expression was wrong-strained, as though the muscles themselves resisted. He staggered back, his throat dry, and nearly dropped the lantern he carried. By the time he looked again, the shutter had closed, and the farmhouse stood in darkness once more. When he returned to camp, he told the others what he had seen. They laughed at first, dismissing it as drink or fatigue, but his trembling hands betrayed him. He repeated the phrase again and again, a child's body, but with a man's jaw, until the laughter faded. The carnival left the valley the next morning, and Garrison refused to walk past the hollow again. Years later, when pressed by a curious reporter, he swore the face was real, and that whatever lived in that farmhouse was neither child nor adult, but something caught uneasily between. The flood came sudden, the kind of summer storm that swelled the mountain creeks into violent torrents overnight. By morning, the valley floor was littered with branches, silt, and debris dragged down from the ridges above. Children searching the banks for trinkets found instead what looked like pale twigs caught between the rocks. At first, no one thought much of it. Storms often carried remnants of livestock buried hastily on the slopes. But when a mill worker stooped to examine a handful more closely, his expression hardened. These were not splinters of wood, nor the brittle bones of calves or goats. They were small, curved, and unmistakably human. The fragments passed quickly into the sheriff's hands, carried to his office in a burlap sack still damp from the creek. He did not summon the coroner, nor did he record the find in his official ledger. Instead, he spread the pieces across his desk, grimaced, and muttered that they were likely from animals washed down in the storm. Those who stood by, however, could see the truth plain in the details. A single jaw fragment held the faint socket of a tooth, and within the sack lay several loose ones, their enamel dulled but intact. They were human teeth, too many to belong to a single child, yet too few to represent two. The number fell strangely in between, as though they had been gathered carelessly, fragments of one life mixed with another. Word spread quickly, though the sheriff discouraged talk. Mothers whispered as they folded laundry, men shook their heads over fence rails, but no one pressed too loudly. The bones had come from upstream, from the direction of the hollow, and the implication was one no one wished to voice. The churchyard held no records of missing children. No graves had been freshly dug, and yet the evidence had come rushing down with the storm, refusing to be buried. Some claimed the bones were remnants of old tragedies, lives lost in epidemics decades before, shallow graves undone by rising water. Others believed they were more recent, the quiet proof of whispers too long ignored. One mill worker, his face pale with certainty, swore he saw initials carved faintly into one fragment, as if a child had scratched a name into wood that later wore away. But the sheriff waved it off, insisting the marks were nothing but grooves from stone and water. The bones were never entered into record, never buried in consecrated ground. They vanished after a time, though no one could say where they had gone. Some suspected the sheriff returned them to the creek, letting the current carry them farther downstream, away from memory. Yet the image lingered, small bones gleaming against wet rocks, teeth scattered like seeds. They were a message from the mountain itself, carried by water, insisting that something once hidden in the hollow had been disturbed and would not stay silent forever. Martha had been little more than a girl herself when she first entered the Blevins household, hired to scrub floors and peel potatoes in exchange for board and a meager wage. She stayed longer than most, bound not by loyalty but by the heavy hand of poverty, her family too poor to refuse steady work. For decades she kept her silence, even after she left the hollow, carrying with her memories she would not put into words. Only in old age, when her body had grown thin and her days few, did she begin to speak of what she had seen. Her voice shook as she recalled the long evenings when she was sent to the upstairs corridor with trays of food. The plates were not laden with roasts or breads like those served to the family below, but with broths and porridges, food that required no chewing. She carried spoons rather than knives, cloths instead of napkins. Behind the locked doors she could hear movement, soft thuds, dragging steps, and the low gurgle of throats that never formed clear words. When she was permitted to enter, always under the sharp eye of a family elder, she found children who did not look at her directly, whose faces bore deep clefts where their mouths had never fully formed, whose attempts at swallowing left them choking and sputtering. Some could not lift their heads without effort, their arms bent strangely, joints twisted at angles that made them seem both fragile and grotesque. One boy, older than the rest, had legs so bowed they scarcely carried him, yet his eyes followed her with an intensity that frightened her more than pity moved her. She said he made a sound once, a laugh that came out broken and sharp, as though mocking the act of joy itself. They kept them alive, but hidden, Martha whispered, her hands twisting in her lap as though she still carried the trays. She insisted the family did not let them die, but also never let them live. They were fed enough to endure, clothed enough to stay warm, yet always confined to those rooms. No schooling, no church, no play. Only shadows of lives measured by silence and the occasional scrape of a spoon against a bowl. When asked why she had not spoken sooner, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I was told not to," she said, "and because I was afraid." The fear, she admitted, never left her. Not of the children themselves, but of the family that kept them. To speak aloud was to risk the same silence that had claimed so many others. Still, in her last years, her conscience pressed her harder than her fear, and so she told her story fragment by fragment, whispered like confession. It was not meant to accuse, only to remember. But in the remembering, she gave shape to what the valley had long suspected, that behind those shuttered windows were lives deliberately concealed, voices that had tried to rise but were forced back into quiet, and children who had never been allowed to be children at all. The ledger was not found among the usual household records of debts and harvest tallies, but hidden in a trunk beneath scraps of fabric and brittle letters tied with twine. It was smaller than the others, bound in worn black leather, its corners softened by years of handling. Unlike the ledgers kept for land transactions or church tithes, this one bore no title on its cover. When opened, the pages revealed not lists of grain or livestock, but a series of entries so stark they seemed more like ciphers than words. Each line began with a pair of initials, always different, but never spelled in full. Next to them was a number, sometimes as low as 1, sometimes reaching 4 or 5. The final column held only 2 words, repeated again and again. Kept inside. Oh? At first glance, it might have been dismissed as some private shorthand, a record of farm tasks or hidden debts. But the initials matched none of the adults known to live in the hollow. When compared with the church register, however, a pattern emerged. The initials aligned with the baptized names of Blevins' children, those who had appeared briefly in the parish book, and then vanished from every other record. The numbers varied, though none could say with certainty what they measured. Some believed they marked ages, others thought they referred to attempts at survival days endured, perhaps, or years counted, until silence reclaimed them. The phrase, "kept inside," was the most haunting. Line after line, the words appeared like a verdict, sealing each entry with finality. There were no marks for burials, no notations of illness, no signs of mourning, only the quiet insistence that these children, reduced to initials, had been confined beyond the reach of the outside world. Those who handled the ledger said it carried a strange wear, the edges of certain pages smudged darker than others, as though fingers had lingered there often. Some initials appeared again and again across different years, suggesting not one child but many bearing similar names, repetitions that blurred individuals into symbols. The record was not of lives lived but of lives catalogued, stripped to letters and numbers, anonymized as though identity itself were unnecessary. What disturbed the valley most was not only the ledger's existence but its secrecy. It was not meant for the eyes of officials, nor even for the church. It was a private record, a family archive that reduced generations of children into shadows on paper. To read it was to glimpse the hollow's truth without ever opening the doors of the farmhouse. Each page whispered the same conclusion, that the Blevins' children had not been forgotten accidentally, but erased deliberately, remembered only in this book whose cold precision ensured they were never truly seen. The physician who returned to the hollow came long after the first had sealed his silence. By then, the Blevins' name was more rumor than fact, a shadow cast over the valley. He was younger than his predecessor, a man trained in the cities who believed medicine was as much about confronting fear as curing illness. When word reached him that the family in the mountains sought his service, he accepted, dismissing the warnings of townsfolk who urged him to stay away. With his bag of instruments and a determination born of pride, he took the narrow path that coiled through the laurel and pine until the Blevins' farmhouse appeared, gray and shuttered, its roofline sagging like a weight too long carried. He wrote later that he was welcomed with civility but little warmth. The adults spoke softly, their gestures precise, as though every movement had been rehearsed. They ushered him into the parlor where two children sat side by side. Both were swathed in shawls despite the summer heat, the fabric drawn up to their chins and pulled low across their brows. Their stillness was remarkable, their heads bowed as if in shame or obedience. He was told they were frail, prone to illness, but the family offered no further detail. When he tried to lift the edge of the cloth, a hand from the patriarch fell heavily on his shoulder, the weight a warning. He did not press. Instead, he checked their pulses, listened to their breathing, noted the faint rattle in one chest, the irregular rhythm in the other. They did not speak. One shifted slightly when his stethoscope touched bone, but otherwise they remained silent, their features never fully revealed. The physician left with the sense of a performance carefully arranged for his benefit. He was shown exactly what the family intended, no more. Yet as he descended the path, the house receding into shadow, he paused. From the open upper window he heard it voices, high and uneven, layered atop one another, not two but many. Some murmured as though in conversation, others broke into a sing-song cadence, thin and strange, like lullabies sung in discord. He stopped, listening, certain that the sounds belonged to children hidden from his sight. They rose and fell until the wind carried them off, leaving only the creak of branches. In his journal, the physician did not accuse, but his words were edged with unease. "I was permitted to see too," he wrote, but the house itself spoke of more. It was a confession dressed in restraint, the careful note of a man who sensed that truth was larger than what he had been allowed to witness. His entry ended without resolution, but the implication lingered. The hollow still kept its secrets, and no doctor, however determined, was ever shown the full measure of what lived behind those shuttered walls. The fire began on a cold night in late autumn, when the leaves had already withered to brittle husks and the wind carried the sharp bite of frost. From the valley below, witnesses saw a glow on the ridge, at first mistaken for lanterns or a brush fire. But as the glow swelled into a furious orange, tongues of flame climbing higher than the tree line, it became clear that the Blevins farmhouse was burning. The blaze devoured the shuttered windows, spat sparks into the black sky, and roared with a violence that seemed almost deliberate, as if the house itself had chosen its own destruction after years of holding its secrets. By the time neighbors dared climb the path, it was too late. The roof had collapsed inward, sending a shower of embers that hissed and died against the wet ground. The walls buckled, and the heavy stone chimney toppled like a felled tree. What remained smoldered through the night, a carcass of beams and ash. Men with buckets stood helpless, their water evaporating before it could reach the flames. Women clutched their shawls tighter, murmuring prayers as though afraid the fire might leap into their own homes below. When morning came, the ruin was little more than blackened timbers jutting from a bed of gray ash. Searchers combed through the wreckage, lifting charred boards and sifting through soot, but no bodies were found. Not a single bone, not a single recognizable fragment of the family said to have lived within. The absence was more haunting than the fire itself. If they had perished, there should have been remains. If they had fled, no tracks led away from the hollow. It was as if the blaze had swallowed not only the house but the people as well. Speculation grew quickly. Some swore the family had burned with their home, their bodies reduced to nothing in a fire hotter than nature should allow. Others insisted the Blevins had escaped before the flames took hold, retreating farther into the mountains where no one would ever find them. There were whispers of a cave, of hidden dwellings carved into rock, of children carried off in the dead of night. The hollow itself became a grave of sorts, not marked by stone but by the charred skeleton of the house. Long after, the ground remained barren where the farmhouse had stood, as though the earth itself refused to heal. Even decades later, no wildflowers grew there, no saplings took root. Travelers passing the ridge claimed the air still smelled faintly of smoke, and on still nights, some said they could hear the echo of voices in the ruins, thin, high, and uneven, rising from the ashes of a house that had hidden them too long. Whether the family died in the fire or vanished into deeper shadow, the hollow became a place of absence, its silence more accusing than proof could ever be. Years after the fire, when the valley had quieted and the hollow lay abandoned, a group of men returned to the blackened foundation of the Blevins farmhouse. Curiosity more than duty drove them back, for the ruins had long resisted explanation. Shovels bit into the earth where floorboards had collapsed, and beneath the charred remains of beams they uncovered a hatch concealed by layers of ash and stone. The iron hinges, fused with rust, groaned when pried open. What lay beneath was a cellar no one had known existed, a room hidden from the world above. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and earth. Their lanterns revealed walls close and damp, built from rough-hewn stone that glistened in the dim light. At first, the men thought the scratches on the walls were the careless marks of tools, but as their eyes adjusted, they saw patterns emerge. Letters, crooked and incomplete, carved with fingernails or bits of stone. Names attempted, but never finished, initials repeated again and again until the grooves deepened. Some were little more than jagged lines, as though hands had trembled or grown too weak to complete them. Others were clearer, a child's effort to leave behind proof of existence. The floor bore its own testimony. Scattered across the packed dirt were toys, crude and handmade, their edges worn from small fingers. A doll of cloth missing its head, a wooden horse snapped at the legs, a ball stitched from scraps of leather, flattened with age. They were the kind of objects that spoke not of joy but of confinement. The playthings of children kept underground, their world reduced to stone walls and shadows. One man lifted a toy whistle carved from bone, pressing it to his lips. No sound came, only a hollow breath that seemed to deepen the silence. The cellar was small, far too small to hold a family, yet every inch bore traces of habitation. A broken cot leaned in the corner. A blanket, stiff with soot, lay crumpled against the wall. The lantern light flickered across the etchings, and the men shivered as they recognized the repetition of certain names they had seen once before in the church ledger. Letters that had appeared in baptismal records now scratched into stone, as if the children themselves had carved their identities in desperation when no other record of them remained. The discovery was spoken of in hushed tones, never written into official reports. The sheriff urged silence, saying nothing good could come of stirring the past. Yet those who descended into that cellar carried the memory for the rest of their lives. The scratches, the broken toys, the evidence of lives lived and hidden, pressed a truth heavier than the fire that had destroyed the house. Whatever the flames had consumed above, what remained below told a story of children kept not just inside the farmhouse, but beneath it, buried alive in life long before they were consigned to silence and death. The records of the asylum list him only as John Doe, admitted in the spring of 1963 after being found wandering near the Tennessee border. He was disheveled, barefoot, and malnourished, but what unsettled those who brought him in was not his state of dress but his appearance. His jaw jutted forward at an unnatural angle, forcing his mouth into a half-open grimace. His hands, twisted and malformed, could not fully close, the fingers bending back upon themselves as if sculpted wrong from the start. His eyes, though, were sharp, too sharp, watching everything with a kind of animal wariness. The doctors believed him simple, perhaps feeble-minded, until he began to speak. His words were halting at first, strung together in broken cadence, but they carried no confusion. He answered direct questions with silence or with fragments that disturbed more than clarified. When asked his name, he whispered a string of initials, the kind that matched old records in the church ledgers. When pressed about his family, he gave only one phrase, repeated over and over in a low rasp. "They kept us from the light." Oh. The staff assumed he meant confinement, a childhood spent in basements or institutions, but the phrase never changed, no matter how the question was shaped. Sometimes he said it rocking back and forth in his bed. Sometimes he whispered it in the courtyard, staring at the sky as if the daylight itself were a rare and precious thing. On one occasion, when shown a Bible, he turned the pages in silence until reaching the Psalms, then began muttering the verses backward, line by line, the cadence strange but steady. His file noted his physical deformities, his limited vocabulary, his odd knowledge of scripture. What the doctors did not record was the way he wept at night, clutching his twisted hands to his chest, repeating the phrase until it became a chant. One nurse later admitted she had asked him once who they were. His response chilled her. He pressed his face close to hers, his jaw trembling, and whispered, "Family." Rumors spread quickly among the staff. An orderly from the valley recognized the shape of his features, the familiar slope of the brow, and swore he looked like a Blevins. When confronted with the name, the man did not deny it. He only repeated his phrase once more fiercely this time, as if demanding it be heard. "They kept us from the light." He died within the year, his body weakened by decades of malnourishment and neglect. No family came to claim him. No stone was placed above his grave. Yet those who had seen him never forgot. To them, he was not just a vagrant with twisted bones, but the last fragment of a story buried in the hollow, proof that the children had lived, endured, and, in their own broken way, remembered. The hollow remains a scar upon the mountain, its path overgrown with brambles and moss, the farmhouse long reduced to cinders and stone. Few climb there now. Hunters skirt the ridge, hikers take longer trails, and the children of the valley are warned not to wander near. They say the air changes as you approach, growing colder even in the height of summer, and that when the wind moves through the trees it carries with it voices, high and thin, not quite laughter, not quite crying. Those who have lingered claim the sound seems to come from beneath the ground, as if the earth itself were breathing secrets it has no wish to keep. For years, historians have argued over the Blevins story. Some dismiss it as folklore, a tale twisted by rumor, until the family became more legend than fact. They say the ledgers were misread, that the torn photographs were accidents of time, that bones in creeks could belong to anyone. Others, however, point to the pattern too consistent to ignore. Baptismal records with no matching graves, testimonies from servants who fled in fear, a physician's notes that skirted truth but never denied it. They argue that silence itself is evidence that so many who lived near the hollow chose to look away rather than confront what might be happening behind shuttered windows. The Black Ledger remains the most damning artifact. Its entries, stark and cold, offer no embellishment. Just initials, numbers, and the phrase, kept inside. It is not the language of folklore, but of record-keeping, as precise as any inventory of cattle or corn. The fact that such a book existed at all makes denial harder. Children were accounted for, but not in ways the world was meant to see. Their names were not meant for gravestones or school registers. They were reduced to letters hidden in rooms confined to the silence of a hollow that tolerated no witness. Even now, when scholars gather to debate the matter, the room grows quiet at mention of the cellar where toys lay broken in the dirt, or of the testimony of the last survivor who whispered, "They kept us from the light." Each fragment alone might be explained away, but together they form a chain too heavy to dismiss. The story may have grown in the telling, but its roots are buried in soil that remembers. So the hollow remains, abandoned but never forgotten, a place where silence is louder than any confession. The ledger's words echo still, not in ink alone, but in the collective unease of a valley that chose not to see. Kept inside. Two words that outlasted the family, the farmhouse, and even the children themselves, an inheritance of silence that history has yet to bury.